They sealed Captain Rowan Mercer inside Containment Vault 7 with the deadliest dragon ever captured, and the galaxy watched as if it were witnessing an execution disguised as a test, because the Drathri warbeast known as Veyrath the Black Inferno had ended 3 campaigns, melted armored divisions into slag, and reduced orbital outposts to drifting coffins, and now the High Coalition Council had decided that if brute force could not tame it, perhaps sacrifice would. Rowan was not a diplomat, not a xenobiologist, not even a negotiator. He was a human combat medic whose record listed impossible extractions under plasma fire and battlefield surgeries performed with failing power cells, and that was precisely why they chose him, because medics ran toward suffering instead of away from it, and if there was even a fractional chance that the dragon's relentless violence stemmed from something other than pure malice, a healer might find it. The vault itself was a kilometer-wide sphere of alloyed neutron steel suspended in a gravitational cradle, its inner atmosphere calibrated to Drathri biology, dense, hot, laced with ionized particles that shimmered like heat mirages. And when the airlock hissed open behind Rowan, sealing him inside with nothing but a medical kit, portable thermal shield, and a pulse rifle he had no intention of firing, every external sensor across Coalition space tuned in. Veyrath lay coiled at the chamber's center, wings folded like obsidian blades, scales absorbing light rather than reflecting it, each breath exhaling a slow ribbon of smoke that curled along the vaulted ceiling, and when its eyes opened, twin furnaces set in shadow. Rowan felt the weight of a predator that had never known defeat. Alarms pulsed as the dragon rose, chains of gravitic anchors clanking against the floor not to restrain it fully but to limit aerial acceleration, because the last time it had been given full range it shattered half the containment fleet. Rowan did not raise his weapon. Instead, he did something no soldier had dared. He stepped forward slowly and knelt, placing his medical pack on the heated ground as if arriving at a battlefield casualty. The dragon's growl rolled through the vault like distant thunder, heat spiking, claws carving furrows into reinforced metal, and across the galaxy commentators whispered that the human would be ash within seconds. Yet Rowan spoke, voice steady despite sweat evaporating from his skin, not in threats or commands but in clinical observation, noting the asymmetry in Veyrath's left wing extension, the subtle hitch in its respiration cycle, the faint discoloration along the ventral scales near the rib line that suggested infection or embedded shrapnel. He had studied the battle footage before volunteering, frame by frame, noticing that each outburst of catastrophic flame coincided with a microsecond flinch, and medics learned to see flinches the way others saw targets. When Veyrath lunged, jaws opening in a blaze of superheated plasma, Rowan did not flee. He activated the thermal shield just enough to deflect the worst of the heat and shouted over the roar that he was not there to cage or command but to treat. The words should have meant nothing to a creature raised in war, yet something in the dragon's strike faltered, flame veering slightly off-center, enough that Rowan remained standing rather than vaporized. Pain recognition was universal across species, and Rowan gambled that Veyrath's fury masked something deeper. He pointed, not at the dragon's eyes or throat, but at its side where the scale discoloration pulsed faintly, and asked permission to approach, a ridiculous gesture given the imbalance of power. Yet the galaxy saw the dragon hesitate, saw the talons flex without descending, saw the inferno dim just a fraction. Slowly, step by measured step, Rowan closed the distance, feeling the oppressive heat press against his armor, until he stood within reach of claws that had torn through cruisers, and then he did what he had done 1,000 times under enemy fire. He examined the wound. Up close, the truth was undeniable. Embedded deep beneath overlapping scales was a shard of compressed neutron alloy from a Coalition dreadnought's hull, lodged near a primary heat gland, each flare of dragonfire driving it deeper and sending waves of agony through neural clusters. Every attempt to burn brighter had only worsened the injury, creating a feedback loop of rage and pain that the galaxy had misread as pure savagery. Rowan looked up into Veyrath's blazing eyes and, for the first time since the dragon's capture, saw not hatred but exhaustion layered beneath fury. "You're not unstoppable," he murmured, voice barely audible over the hum of containment fields. "You're wounded." And across countless worlds, beings who had lost cities to black fire watched a human medic place his rifle aside, sterilize a surgical clamp in open heat, and prepare to reach into the side of the deadliest dragon alive, fully aware that one twitch of those colossal muscles would end him, yet believing with every scar-earned instinct that sometimes the most dangerous monsters were simply untreated patients, and that if he could remove the shard without triggering another catastrophic flare, the galaxy might learn that healing could accomplish what fleets never had. The first incision was not with a blade but with trust, because Rowan knew that cutting into living scale without consent would provoke a reflexive inferno capable of breaching even neutron steel walls. So he kept one gloved hand visible at all times and narrated every movement in a calm cadence used for terrified soldiers pinned beneath rubble, explaining the nature of embedded fragments, the necessity of extraction, the inevitability of pain before relief. Varatha's breathing intensified, each exhale rippling heat distortions across the vault, yet the dragon did not strike as Rowan extended a portable diagnostic wand, its field mapping the shard's precise depth and angle. The reading confirmed his fear. The fragment had fused partially with regenerating tissue, meaning removal would tear flesh unless counterheated to soften the surrounding scale matrix. Rowan improvised, adjusting his thermal shield into a focused emitter to gently warm the area around the wound, synchronizing its frequency with the dragon's internal heat rhythm so it would feel less like invasion and more like resonance. Sweat streamed down his spine, evaporating almost instantly, while outside the vault analysts argued whether the dragon's stillness signaled calculation before annihilation. Then Rowan made his move, sliding the sterilized clamp between scales, careful not to touch nerve clusters mapped by the scanner, and when metal met metal deep within living tissue, Varath roared, a sound that cracked monitoring arrays and sent shockwaves through the containment cradle. Flame erupted reflexively, slamming against Rowan's shield and forcing him to one knee, but he did not release his grip. Instead he braced, waited for the surge to crest, and pulled with controlled precision. The shard resisted, fused by scar tissue and months of embedded trauma, and for a heartbeat Rowan feared it would snap, leaving fragments that would doom them both. "Hold," he gasped, not as command but plea, and astonishingly the dragon's thrashing lessened, claws gouging trenches yet avoiding the fragile human at its side. With one final wrench timed between breaths, the fragment tore free in a spray of superheated blood that hissed upon contact with the floor, and Rowan immediately pressed a coagulant patch into the cavity, activating regenerative foam that expanded to seal ruptured vessels. Varatha's roar shifted in pitch, from agony to something raw and unfiltered, and then, impossibly, the dragon collapsed onto its forelimbs, not in defeat but in relief so profound it resembled surrender. The vault's temperature plummeted as uncontrolled fire ceased, replaced by steady internal warmth no longer spiking with every movement. Rowan worked quickly to stabilize the wound, layering antimicrobial gel and biofilm mesh designed for starship hull breaches yet repurposed for living armor, speaking continuously to anchor both patient and himself through the aftermath tremors. Outside, silence rippled across the galaxy as feeds confirmed what sensors barely comprehended. The deadliest dragon had ceased attacking not because it was subdued, but because its pain had been addressed. When Rowan finally stepped back, holding the extracted shard aloft like evidence in a trial, Varath lifted its massive head and regarded him without the previous blaze of annihilation. The eyes still burned, but now with clarity rather than chaos. The dragon extended one colossal wing experimentally, flexing, without the prior hitch, and released a measured plume of flame that rose straight upward in controlled brilliance instead of explosive scatter. Containment alarms quieted. Analysts recalibrated threat levels, and in that charged stillness Rowan did something unprecedented. He reached out and rested his hand lightly against an uninjured scale near the dragon's jaw. The contact should have been insignificant against such magnitude, yet Varath did not recoil. Instead, a low rumble vibrated through the vault, not warning but acknowledgement. Across the galaxy, beings who had known the dragon only as Apocalypse witnessed a human medic standing unburned beside it, shard removed, wound sealed, and for the first time since the wars began, the narrative shifted from extermination to understanding, because it became undeniable that the Inferno's devastation had been amplified by untreated agony, and that a single act of courage armed with compassion had accomplished what entire armadas failed to achieve. Recovery did not transform Varath into something gentle, but it restored equilibrium, and equilibrium altered everything, because within days the dragon's vital readings stabilized to pre-injury baselines reconstructed from early battle telemetry, revealing that the catastrophic overfires which had devastated fleets were aberrations coinciding precisely with the shard's embedment. Rowan remained inside the vault by choice, monitoring healing progression, adjusting thermal gradients to prevent scar contraction, and documenting behavioral shifts with meticulous detail that blurred the line between medic and diplomat. Conversations emerged, not in spoken language at first, but in patterned pulses of heat and low-frequency vibrations that Rowan learned to interpret as emotional states rather than tactical calculations. Veyrath's fury had always masked something older: territorial defense triggered by coalition expansion into Drathri nesting sectors. A war ignited by mutual misinterpretation and escalated by pain. Once stabilized, the dragon demonstrated astonishing restraint, even assisting in recalibrating containment fields by channeling controlled flame bursts to reinforce structural stress points, proving that its destructive capacity could be redirected with intent. The Council, initially prepared to terminate the experiment at the first sign of failure, instead authorized extended interaction under Rowan's supervision, though not without dissent from admirals who had lost crews to black fire. Yet data spoke louder than vengeance. The absence of uncontrolled flares, the improved wing articulation, the measurable decrease in cortisol-equivalent markers within Drathri physiology. When Rowan finally exited the vault for debriefing, he did not present himself as hero but as witness, holding up the extracted shard as the simplest explanation for years of bloodshed. "We fought a wounded guardian and called it a monster," he told the assembly, voice steady despite political tension, and the statement reverberated beyond chambers into civilian networks hungry for change. Negotiations began not with treaties but with transparency, sharing environmental impact assessments, acknowledging territorial encroachments, and inviting Drathri observers to verify medical findings. Veyrath, once symbol of annihilation, became reluctant ambassador, its presence at orbital summits both reminder of devastation and testament to transformation. Rowan continued as liaison, bridging biological and cultural gaps with the same steady patience he had used in surgery, reminding both sides that healing required maintenance, that old scars could reopen if ignored. Slowly, conflict zones cooled, joint patrols replaced siege formations, and research collaborations explored atmospheric stabilization technologies to restore damaged nesting grounds. The galaxy, accustomed to cycles of retaliation, struggled to recalibrate around a narrative where compassion had strategic value, yet results were undeniable. Casualty rates plummeted, trade routes reopened, and Drathri Flame once feared now powered shared infrastructure in controlled plasma arrays. Through it all, Rowan resisted mythologizing, insisting he had simply treated a patient, but history seldom preserved modesty over impact. Years later, historians would mark the sealing of Containment Vault 7 not as an attempted execution but as the hinge upon which interstellar history turned, because from that moment forward the image most replayed across systems was not of cities burning but of a human medic kneeling before a dragon and choosing to heal rather than kill. Veyrath bore a pale scar along its rib line where neutron alloy once festered, a visible reminder that even the mightiest could be undone by unattended wounds, and Rowan bore his own quieter scars. Political backlash, the weight of lives lost before understanding prevailed, but neither regretted the risk. Together they inaugurated the Accord of Embers, a framework recognizing Drathri sovereignty and establishing rapid response medical exchange units trained to address cross-species crises before escalation could calcify into war. Academies taught the Mercer Protocol, emphasizing observational empathy under threat conditions, and military doctrines were amended to include mandatory bioassessment before categorizing alien aggression as hostile intent. Critics argued that not every enemy hit a removable shard, and Rowan agreed, yet he countered that assuming none did guaranteed perpetual conflict. The galaxy did not become utopia overnight. There were still skirmishes, still mistrust, but the precedent endured. When faced with overwhelming danger, one could choose curiosity over annihilation. In the final public address of his career, Rowan stood beside Veyrath on a platform overlooking a rebuilt orbital city once scarred by dragonfire, and he spoke not of bravery but of perspective, reminding listeners that pain distorts behavior across species, that healing is not weakness but recalibration, and that sometimes the deadliest force in the universe is simply suffering with no one willing to reach into the fire. As Veyrath unfurled its wings and released a controlled arc of flame into the twilight sky, brilliant, contained, almost beautiful, the crowd did not recoil. They watched in reverent silence, understanding that they were witnessing more than spectacle. They were witnessing proof that courage armed with compassion could redirect the course of civilizations. And long after both Medic and Dragon had passed into legend, children across worlds would study the recording of a lone human stepping into a vault with nothing but a medical kit and impossible resolve. And they would learn that the galaxy would never forget the result. Not because a monster was defeated, but because it was healed. Peace did not make the galaxy gentle. It made it cautious, observant, and painfully aware of how close it had come to endless extinction, and 5 years after the shard was removed from Veyrath's side, a new crisis emerged that threatened to unravel everything Captain Rowan Mercer had fought to build. Deep in the Perseid fringe, a Drathari broodship signaled distress, its internal heat signatures collapsing one by one as if an unseen frost crept through living flame, and when Coalition scouts arrived, they found dragons grounded, wings rigid, fire sacs dimmed to embers that refused to reignite. The phenomenon spread quickly across shared territories, striking both Drathari and allied species that relied on high-temperature plasma systems, and panic whispered through diplomatic channels that perhaps coexistence had angered some ancient force, or worse, that a biological countermeasure had been engineered by extremists unwilling to accept the Accord of Embers. Rowan, now head of the Interstellar Medical Response Corps, recognized the pattern not as curse or sabotage but as pathology. An adaptive pathogen targeting thermal regulation pathways, exploiting the very evolutionary resilience that made dragons formidable. Veyrath, older yet no less imposing, volunteered to accompany Rowan into the infected sector despite risk, arguing that leadership demanded visible solidarity, and together they boarded the drifting broodship whose corridors glowed faintly with dying heat. Inside, Rowan moved from dragon to dragon, scanning vitals and mapping the pathogen spread, discovering that it bonded to the lining of fire sacs, dampening ignition impulses and triggering systemic hypothermia in creatures whose biology depended on controlled combustion. Worse, it mutated rapidly in response to external flame exposure, meaning traditional cauterization techniques accelerated its evolution. As news leaked, factions within the coalition demanded quarantine and orbital sterilization of affected zones, echoing the old logic of destruction over understanding, and Rowan felt history threatening to repeat itself. But Veyrath intervened in council transmissions, projecting a calm authority forged through shared struggle, reminding both species that fear had once nearly destroyed them and that abandoning the infected now would shatter fragile trust. Under mounting pressure, Rowan proposed an audacious plan. Rather than attacking the pathogen with heat, they would starve it by temporarily lowering dragon core temperatures under controlled conditions, placing them into induced thermal stasis while introducing a tailored antiviral synthesized from human adaptive immune markers combined with Drathari regenerative enzymes. The procedure was unprecedented, risky, and required dragons to suppress instinctual fire responses, essentially trusting that humans would not exploit their vulnerability. The first volunteer was Veyrath. Inside a reinforced medical cradle, the once Deadliest dragon allowed Rowan to oversee gradual cooling of its internal furnace, scales losing some luster as core heat declined, while antiviral nanites infused through vascular channels. The galaxy held its breath again, not in anticipation of annihilation this time but in hope that cooperation could outpace catastrophe. Hours stretched, readings fluctuated, and when Veyrath's heat sac finally reignited in controlled brilliance. Steady, uninfected, stronger than before. A wave of relief cascaded through fleets and colonies alike. Production of the hybrid antiviral accelerated, joint human Drathari teams distributing it across infected sectors, and casualty curves flattened where doom had seemed certain. Yet the crisis left scars, not of flame but of memory, reminding all that peace required constant vigilance. As broodship engines reignited and grounded dragons took to the sky once more, Rowan realized that healing had evolved beyond individual acts of bravery into systemic resilience, and that the bond forged in a sealed vault now safeguarded entire civilizations. But even as celebrations flickered across star systems, encrypted signals hinted that the pathogen's origin was not natural drift but deliberate release, seeded from beyond known borders, suggesting that somewhere in the darkness, forces still feared a united galaxy, and were willing to test its resolve again. The investigation led beyond mapped territories into the null expanse, a region once dismissed as lifeless static where long-range probes malfunctioned and navigation systems glitched, and there Rowan and Veyrath discovered not void but observers. an ancient nomadic species known as the Caliph, energy-adapted entities who had watched organic civilizations burn and rebuild for millennia, concluding that conflict was an inevitable constant best accelerated to maintain cosmic equilibrium. To them, the Accord of Embers represented a destabilizing anomaly, proof that two apex species could redirect violence into cooperation, threatening the predictive models upon which the Caliph based their detached stewardship. The thermal pathogen had been their experiment, a calculated stress test designed to determine whether unity would fracture under existential strain. Confronted aboard a luminous Caliph construct that pulsed with cold starlight. Rowan did not arrive with fleets but with data, records of mutual aid missions, casualty reductions, atmospheric restoration projects powered by shared flame, and testimonies from worlds once divided now thriving through collaboration. Veyrath, towering within the alien chamber yet radiating disciplined heat rather than wrath, recounted its own transformation from weapon to guardian, illustrating that change was not anomaly but evolution. The Caliph argued that harmony would stagnate growth, that adversity sharpened species, and Rowan conceded that challenge was essential, but engineered suffering divorced from empathy was entropy masquerading as balance. As debate unfolded, sensors detected a destabilizing surge within the Caliph construct, an internal energy cascade triggered by their own failed pathogen models rebounding unpredictably, threatening to implode the station and annihilate all within range. Faced with imminent catastrophe, the Caliph hesitated, bound by doctrine that forbade intervention in self-caused collapse, yet Rowan and Veyrath acted without waiting for philosophical permission. Rowan coordinated emergency field adjustments while Veyrath channeled precisely modulated flame into failing conduits, not to destroy but to stabilize, mirroring the delicate extraction years earlier in the vault. Together they prevented implosion, preserving even those who had sought to divide them. In the aftermath, the Caliph confronted evidence not theoretical but lived, that cooperation under duress generated strength neither isolation nor manipulation could achieve. Their models recalibrated, ancient certainties fracturing as they acknowledged that unity did not erase growth but redefined it. They withdrew the remaining pathogen strains and pledged observational neutrality rather than interference, opening corridors through the null expanse previously shrouded in distortion. When Rowan and Veyrath returned to known space, they carried not trophies but expanded horizons, and the galaxy greeted them not as saviors but as proof that resilience scaled. From a shard removed in a sealed vault to alliances spanning species and stars. In academies and hatcheries alike, the lesson endured. The deadliest dragon and a human combat medic had rewritten assumptions not through dominance but through relentless compassion under pressure. And as Veyrath soared beside coalition cruisers across newly charted routes, its flame illuminating paths once swallowed by darkness, the galaxy understood that what it would never forget was not merely the result of a daring experiment long ago, but the ongoing choice to heal where destruction seemed easier, a choice that echoed far beyond any single vault, into the very architecture of the future.